Hey guys, Brent Hull Build Show, talking today about scale, proportion, and the divided light window. Why it matters, what's important today in the Build Show. Scale and proportion. I'm not going to get into strict definitions of scale and proportion. The big picture on scale and proportion is that proportion is how proportionate they are between the parts. If you're looking at a house and the door is out of proportion to the size of the windows, the proportions are off, okay? Scale is how those pieces and parts relate to us, okay? And so there is a human scale, right? We become this measuring piece that determines whether those things are in the right proportion and scale, okay? So when you look at a house and something doesn't look right, oftentimes the proportion and scale, the parts and pieces, and then how we relate to them is messed up. Now, the prettiest place I think in America is Colonial Williamsburg. Colonial Williamsburg has this sense of scale and proportion to the size of the buildings, to the size of the street, to the size of the windows. Now, why does that streetscape look so attractive, right? It's because the parts and the pieces, nothing's huge, nothing's out of proportion, say. There is a relationship, and especially as you can see the people walking along there, that you can look at and go, oh, I get it, right? You immediately understand what's going on there. You feel comfortable. Now, historic houses are really good at this. And if you've ever been to an historic room and you go, I don't know why I like this, I just like it, right? It's because the proportion and scale of those parts and pieces are relating to us. There's the human scale. If you've watched my videos on the classical system and the proportions and things like that, we relate to, and those classical proportions relate to the human body, right? And so when we innately understand those parts and pieces, we feel better in those spaces. Now, a lot of times what happens with new houses is the proportion and scale of the parts and pieces end up whacked out, right? If you look at this mailbox, right, there is a huge ball on top of the mailbox, and if you just kind of glance at it, you're like, okay, that's a decorated mailbox. But then if you look at the actual mailbox, the actual piece, it looks dwarfed compared to the size of the base of that little decorative piece, to the size of the ball, and all of a sudden the proportion of the parts and the pieces and the scale is thrown off. And all of a sudden you start looking at that and it makes you quizzical, right? It makes you kind of go, wait, what am I looking at? The same thing is true with this house, in my opinion, in that there's this big, tall entry, the windows are kind of dropped down too low, and you're wondering how you're supposed to relate to this, especially when you look at where the door handle is, and the door handle ends up being this very important piece that helps you read the scale of it. You are thrown off. You don't innately look at this, and this is why oftentimes I like historic houses more than new houses, is because there's a proportionate scale to them, especially pre-1940 houses that are just more beautiful. Here's what's happened, and we're talking about divided light windows. The windows, especially in a historic house, are the eyes to the home, right? They are something that we read and we look at it and we think it's beautiful. Now, there's nothing worse, exaggerating, there are a lot of things worse, but there's nothing worse than on an historic house when they've taken out the divided light windows and they just put it in a big sheet of glass. Interestingly, I drove by this house all the time when I first got back to Fort Worth, and I go, oh, it's so tragic they tore out those windows. Well, then I drove by a little bit closer and I looked down and I noticed that the windows were actually still there. And what they had actually done was take solar panels and put them over the window. But I think this really helps you understand how important those divided lights are to the scale and the proportion of the house. Without those divided lights, it looks like the eyes of that home have just been poked out. Then when you see the divided lights there, you go, oh, now I get it, now I understand, now I can relate to it, and it becomes immediately, in my opinion, more beautiful. When you think about windows, you think about the Georgian windows or the period revival windows or the Victorian windows. They all have a shape and a size and a scale that we read, that we recognize, that we appreciate. And so getting those divided light windows right, okay, not only communicates proper scale and proportion and helps you read the house, but it also tells a story of design and scale and beauty that is really important, especially with historic houses. Oftentimes what happens on new houses, right, and you'll see it in this picture here, is that the scale of the actual window panes end up getting too big, okay, in my opinion. And it's hard to read what's going on with this house because those window panes are so large. Look at the door and where that door is, right? You kind of understand, okay, well, there's what a person would be because I can understand walking through that door, but those panes are so big, we lose sense of and we become a little bit quizzical about, wait, what am I looking at? Is that a dormer? Is that a window? Am I supposed to be looking through that? What's going on there? And so it doesn't communicate as clearly. And so when you're designing and when you're putting together and when you're thinking about historic windows, there's a few things that are important and critical in this design steps. First is keep your panes rectangles, okay? Win those window squares, okay? And think about it this way. When I'm taking this window, okay? And if it was just a big sheet plate of glass and it just read as one pane, there's no shadow lines, there's no details, it's hard to read. It's like something's been poked out. But when this has been divided, right, we can all of a sudden, it brings it down to a scale that we can understand. When you're dividing these windows, and historically on almost all pre-1940 houses, you will see that the window panes are made in rectangles. And if you study historic houses, you know that there were standard sizes for glass, 12 by 16, 16 by 19. There was always a rectangle. Second piece is that the rectangles were always vertical, okay? And it's not until you get into the modern period of the 30s, 40s, and 50s that you see that rectangle turned on its side. If you think about the Farnsworth house, that is Mies van der Rohe doing that big glass house, those rectangle bead sheets of glass are turned on their side and it's these horizontal lines. Oftentimes in the ranch period, those windows are turned horizontal and it's expressing, like Frank Lloyd Wright would do in the Prairie style, those horizontal lines and the length of the house, okay? So that rectangle is very important. Whether it sits up straight or whether it's turned on its side, it really helps you communicate what's going on design-wise. Furthermore, if you look at historic houses, most time the windows were based on a golden ratio, 3 by 5, 5 by 8. And so you would actually see designers design the whole window, okay, based on a golden ratio. And then you break down even into the little individual panes of glass would also be based on that golden ratio. It's a pretty ratio, it's a pretty design. We're naturally attracted to it. And so if you study the golden ratio, you understand that there is an innate relationship. There's golden ratios in my hand to my elbow, my finger, my index, my finger. We are made up of these golden ratios. Leonardo da Vinci freaked out about all this, but when you're designing a window, if you can stay within those golden ratio proportions, you will have a more beautiful house, more beautiful details, all the way down to an individual window pane. You know, historically in these windows, you would see these standard sizes and they were made into those shapes and those sizes. We couldn't get big plate glass windows in the 1760s, right? That's not an invention until the 1950s. So the small panes of glass were really important. In fact, I remember reading Edith Wharton's book about looking at windows, and that was during a period where the bigger pieces of glass was something you wanted to show off as a sign of wealth. It was a sign of raising technology, and she admitted that the smaller divided panes of glass did help with the scale of the house and did make it more beautiful. So when you're looking at windows, remember that all these parts and pieces matter, right? So if you've got an historic house, right? Let's say you've got a bungalow and you've got 1/1 windows, okay? There were historic methods for introducing that divided light look into your thing, even if your original windows are 1/1. We did a railroad depot in Texas, in Teague, Texas, and we built these screens, right? Now these screens were a divided light upper and lower, right? What it was doing was they were showing a divided light upper, very decorative divided light upper, and then a divided light lower, right? This was a way to create that beautiful scale and proportion, and these were in the window screens. The same thing is true with the storm windows. You could order storm windows, much like we make for our windows, with a divided light storm window, so that you could introduce that scale and proportion. So there are historic ways to introduce that beauty, right, without having to change your windows out. as builders, okay, please do not look at the window decision as just being something somebody else decides. Realize that it is an important architectural element that you should have a hand in, and you should be helping helping your client figure out how to make the most beautiful windows. Now look, this is mostly true on traditional styles. If you're working in very modern styles, remember, even Mies van der Rohe, it was very important that that proportion of that piece of glass, even though it's a big piece of plate glass, was still belonging to that golden ratio. So there are decisions you can make that help the style of your house, help you build better if you just watch the details. Be sure to follow me on Instagram and Facebook, Hull Millwork, Hull Homes. I'm Brent Hull. Thanks for watching.